The third point is about a default to transparency. So we've said that access to information is just much harder in a virtual environment. You've got more information to be shared, it's more distributed, and the risk is people are going to be left out of the loop, and that just causes confusion, frustration, and ultimately poorer quality decision making for your organisation and duplication of effort. So the research strongly points to transparency being a key lever for effective virtual teams. So that's about making everything open and available to everyone, unless there's a really specific reason why you're not doing that. And that's kind of the flip, kind of the reverse really, the way people are kind of tend to operate. So that's quite a mindset shift for a lot of organisations and leaders. So it's down to the leader really to role model that. It's about being really clear on expectations around information sharing, what needs to be shared, how you're going to share it and when. It's about establishing procedures for that and norms for communication. It's about, as a leader, it's about taking ownership for making sure that happens. So recognising, rewarding when it does happen, monitoring and intervening when you see it's gone off track or something's not being shared in the way you were hoping, giving people the support and training they need to make that shift to a different way of working, and facilitating sharing of information about day-to-day activities and being really transparent with each other about when things have gone off course. Because there's nothing that's going to erode trust more often. If you say you're going to do something by Tuesday and then, Wednesday rolls around and you still haven't done it, Thursday, if you can just tell people earlier, then that sorts things out and builds trust. So the other thing in this arena is what's called asynchronous working. So the idea that you start to capture everything, rather than doing it all by face-to-face or by Zoom, you start using kind of platforms to capture information in kind of written form. You're codifying workplace knowledge essentially and creating some sort of knowledge bank of what you're working on. So there's certainly some of the remote only companies like Basecamp gets talked to a lot, and GitLab and Automatic, the company behind WordPress, they've adopted that approach. And I think one of them at least says if it's not written down, it doesn't exist. So that's quite an extreme version of things, but as you move to more virtual working, I think it's worth looking at that.
So, and I guess the research is actually proposing managers, it's quite a sea change, isn't it? Because, if we're talking about being transparent with information, there's a lot of information on managers' desks right now that maybe they'd be worried about like scaring staff or overwhelming them or making them feel insecure. So the academic research is actually flipping that and saying, it's okay to disclose more of that. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly what it's saying. So, and I think it's also important to realise that this default to transparency is not just about sharing task information. It's about sharing social information and contextual information about the environment and the culture. And as a leader, it's about thinking and working out loud. So being really explicit about the message you're trying to get across to your individuals or your team. Go overboard on explaining the rationale, because things are so easily misinterpreted when you're working virtually, and there's less informal opportunities to check up. So if you hear something in a meeting and you're not entirely sure what was meant, you've got that kind of chance as you leave the meeting to say, you said that, what did you mean? That doesn't happen when you're in a virtual environment. So if you leave people with gaps in their knowledge, they're going to fill them in on their own. We're programmed as humans to kind of make sense of things. So it's better as a leader to explain and give people the information to fill in the gaps rather than leave them to their own devices to come up with horror stories.
I love that thought of working out loud. It helps take people on the journey when you're making decisions, doesn't it? And kind of like what is in your mind or what are your considerations when making key decisions, and it increases buy-in, doesn't it? So that people don't necessarily feel decisions are being done to them. Absolutely. They're actually going with them, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And even if it's difficult news that you've got to share, the more open and transparent you can be, then the better people react. People don't like uncertainty, so give them as much certainty as you can, even if it's not great news.
If anyone wants to take their reading any further, some really good stuff by Barry Oshry that looks at the importance of actually sharing your information and carving out responsibility and sharing that with your staff to empower them as well.
Absolutely. And then just last point on default to transparency, it picks up the cultural and behavioural norms again. So the cultural and behavioural norms are less visible in a virtual world. So as a leader, you really have to step up and take responsibility for explaining the culture and the norms, making them explicit, name it when you see it operating in practice, codify it, get it written down, and tell stories that reinforce that culture so you can keep it alive even if you're not physically all together.